As we launched in a last month study, we looked at the connections between Daniel chapters 2, 7, and 9, and how they relate to Matthew 24 and the first 13 chapters in the book of Revelation. Attention was called to the section in our deep dive document that goes into greater detail on the image in Daniel chapter 2, which prophesied the rise and fall of empires contemporaneous to Daniel and those far out into the future. We learned how redemptive history has played out over time. Therefore, knowing where we've been and seeing the patterns will help us to understand where we're going and future patterns we can anticipate and discern. We acknowledge that this diagram starts from a dispensational, premillennial, pre-tribulation eschatological view, and that Paul planned to focus on the blue vertical highlighted area, which is the 7-year tribulation period we read about in Revelation chapter 11, as well as Jeremiah chapter 30, and of course our study anchor text, Matthew 24. First, let's set the background. We go back in time to around 1200 BC in the Gregorian calendar, which is when Moses conveys the land sabbatical rest law in Exodus chapter 23. As time went on, the Israelites willingly ignored God's governance, violated his covenant, and started embracing the idolatry present in the cultures around them. God commanded Israel that after 6 years of cultivation, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest in the 7th year, during which they were not to sow or prune. God's wisdom is that land required Sabbath rest because rest restores, a principle extending beyond human workers to the entire created order. Life operates through an essential rhythm swinging between full engagement and intentional disengagement, between creating and recreating, between work and restorative rest. Who best than he who created the universe to provide instructions on how to optimize soil for highest crop yields? Practically, allowing land to lie fallow assured its continued fertility, a crucial concern in the fragile, dry environment of the eastern Mediterranean. Preservation of the soil was therefore enshrined in the laws God gave Israel for guidance in their land use. Continuous cultivation depletes soil nutrients, so the sabbatical year functioned as an agricultural necessity, not merely a spiritual exercise. Beyond agronomic benefit, the Sabbath rest embodied a theological truth. The ancient Israelites treated the land as part of their ethical, covenanted community, respecting it and recognizing moral constraints on its use because they understood it was given to them as a gift. The Israelites were warned that however successful their farming, they must never forget that the land's fertility arises from God's care for nature rather than simply human manipulation. The Sabbath year reminded them they were stewards, not owners, that their real security lay not in the land's products alone, but in their just and righteous treatment of land, animals, and neighbors. The law also carried social dimensions. Peasants were allowed to eat from the natural abundance of untended fields, ensuring the poor shared in the land's provision during these years of rest. The Israelites initially obeyed this law, but eventually abandoned it. For 490 years they continuously planted and harvested, neglecting 70 Sabbath years that should have been observed. Why did they neglect the land Sabbaths? It seems a broader pattern of idolatry, immorality, and corruption accompanied the Sabbath neglect, which together made Israel ripe for judgment. The Sabbath year violation wasn't an isolated failure, but part of a comprehensive spiritual decline. Judah worshipped gods made of wood and stone, and the prophets warned such idolatry would cause removal from the land. As people turned from the true God to idols, immorality increased throughout society. The Sabbath year neglect likely stemmed from the same root cause as these other violations, a fundamental rejection of God's authority and a prioritization of immediate economic gain over obedience. Corrupt rulers lived in luxury while the land was poverty-stricken, building palaces through forced labor that left workers dead or unpaid. In such a climate of greed and self-interest, the countercultural practice of leaving land fallow, trusting God to provide, would have seemed economically foolish and politically impossible to enforce. It's doubtful the Sabbath year was even celebrated in early Israel, as Jeremiah reminded the people their fathers had ignored this law. What began as sporadic neglect hardened into institutional abandonment, eventually requiring divine intervention through exile to restore what human disobedience had forfeited. King Solomon's reign falls squarely within the 490-year period of Sabbath neglect. Solomon reigned 40 years over the United Kingdom of Israel, circa 971 to 931 BC, while the Sabbath violation period ran from approximately 1076 BC to 586 BC, meaning Solomon ruled during the middle centuries of this extended period of disobedience. Notably, Solomon himself embodied the very pattern that characterized the entire 490-year span. He spent 7 years on the temple, but lavished 13 years on his own house, demonstrating misplaced priorities that reflected broader spiritual decline. His Egyptian marriage and resort to the high places foreshadow his overt apostasy, and Solomon became apostate due to the influence of foreign wives. Beyond personal idolatry, Solomon's policies created systemic injustice that would characterize the monarchy throughout this period. Solomon establishes the corvée, in which families yield to subscription or forced labor, in service of the throne 1 month out of 3. Solomon's policies put an inordinate economic burden on the north, and his conscription of forced labor and sale of 20 cities in Galilee to Hiram of Tyre were resented. These oppressive practices mirrored the corrupt rule that plagued Judah throughout the 490 years, rulers building palaces through forced labor while the land suffered. So Solomon didn't cause the exile alone, but his reign exemplified the idolatry, economic exploitation, and spiritual rebellion that accumulated across generations until God's judgment fell. God's judgment corresponded precisely to these violations. For each Sabbath year ignored, the Israelites received 1 year of exile, allowing the land to catch up on its rest. This Sabbath neglect represented a fundamental dishonor toward God, with commercial activity on the sacred day functioning as a public rejection of his authority. After repeated warnings went unheeded, God enforced a Sabbath rest upon the land through the Babylonian captivity, 70 long years during which the land lay desolate. The timeline reveals remarkable precision. Counting from Jerusalem's fall in 586 BC, forward 70 years arrives at 516 BC, the exact year the returning exiles rebuilt and dedicated the Second Temple. Counting backward 490 years from 516 BC places the beginning of Sabbath neglect around 1076 BC, during the period of the Judges when Israel had no king and everyone did as they saw fit. The underlying principle is that God honors those who honor him, with Sabbath-keeping serving as a visible marker of submission to his authority, while Sabbath-breaking demonstrated rebellion. The exile thus functioned not merely as punishment, but as enforced restoration. The land finally received the rest its inhabitants had denied it for nearly 5 centuries. Daniel's prophecy concerns 70 weeks decreed to accomplish several divine purposes: ending transgression, atoning for iniquity, establishing everlasting righteousness, and sealing both vision and prophecy. Daniel 9, verse 24 through 27. The prophecy divides this period into distinct segments with specific events marking each transition. The timeline begins with a decree to restore Jerusalem and extends to the arrival of an anointed prince, spanning 7 weeks. Following this initial period, 62 additional weeks pass during Jerusalem's reconstruction, though amid difficult circumstances. After these 62 weeks conclude, an anointed figure will be removed and lose his position. Subsequently, forces associated with the coming prince will destroy the city and sanctuary, with the city's end accompanied by warfare. The final week involves a ruler establishing a covenant with many people. Though midway through this period he terminates sacrificial worship, and desolation continues until the predetermined conclusion arrives. Interpreters generally understand these sevens as years, totaling 490 years. Daniel received this revelation around 538 to 537 BC, when the 70-year Babylonian captivity prophesied by Jeremiah was nearing completion. Rather than addressing Daniel's immediate question about Israel's return, God revealed that ultimate restoration and the Messianic kingdom would occur not at the captivity's end, but at the conclusion of the 70-week period. Interpretations divide between those viewing the prophecy as centered on Christ's coming, typically treating the first 69 weeks as literal years, and those rejecting a Christological reading, with disagreement particularly concerning whether the final 7 years have already been fulfilled or remain future.